Well, hello, this is Eric Topol with Ground Truths, and I'm very delighted to welcome uh, Professor Bruce Lanphear from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia for a very interesting topic, and that's about lead exposure. We tend to think about lead poisoning with the Flint, Michigan, but there's a lot more to this story. So, welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so you had a New England Journal of Medicine review in October last year, which was probably a wake up for to me, and I'm sure to many others. We'll link to that, where you reviewed the whole topic. I mean, the title is called Lead Poisoning, but of course, it's not just about uh, big dose, but rather chronic exposure. So maybe you could give us a bit of an overview of that review that you wrote for NEJM.
Yeah. So we really focused on the things where we feel like there's a definitive link. Things like lead and diminished IQ in children, lead and coronary heart disease, lead and chronic renal disease. As you mentioned, we've typically thought of lead as sort of the overt lead poisoning, where somebody becomes acutely ill. But over the past century, what we've learned is that lead is one of those toxic chemicals where it's the chronic wear and tear on our bodies that catches up, and it's at the root of many of these chronic diseases that are causing problems today.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. The one that grabbed me, that kind of almost fell out of my chair, was that in 2019, when I guess the most recent data, there was 5.5 million deaths ascribed, cardiovascular deaths ascribed to relatively low levels, or I guess there is no safe level of lead exposure. That's really striking. That's a lot of people dying from something that the cardiology and medical community is not really aware of. And there's a figure three that will also show in the text, the transcript, where you show the level where you start to see a takeoff. It starts very low, and by 50 micrograms per liter, you're seeing a twofold risk, and there's no threshold. It keeps going up.
Yeah.
How many of us do you think are exposed to that type of level as adults, Bruce?
Well, as adults, if we go back in time, all of us, if you go back to the 1970s when lead was still in gasoline, the median blood lead level of Americans was about 13 to 15 microgram per deciliter. So we've all been exposed historically to those levels. And part of the reason we've begun to see a striking decline in coronary heart disease, which peaked in 1968. And by 1978, there was a 20% decline. 190,000 more people were alive than expected. So even in that first decade, there was this striking decline in coronary heart disease. And so, in addition to the prospective studies that have found this link between an increase in lead exposure and death from cardiovascular disease and more specifically coronary heart disease, we can look back in time and see how the decline in leaded gasoline led to a decline in heart disease and hypertension.
Yeah, but it looks like it's still a problem. And it's you have a phenomenal graph that's encouraging, where you see this 95% reduction in lead exposure from the 1970s. And as you said, you have the factors that can be ascribed to, like getting rid of lead from gasoline and others. But what is troubling is that we still have a lot of people that this could be a problem. Now, one of the things you it was fascinating is that you get into that herbal supplements could be a risk factor. That we don't do screening, of course. Should we do screening? And there's certain people that particularly that you consider at high risk that should get screened. So I wasn't aware. I mean, the one type of supplements that you zoomed in on, how do you say it? Ayurvedic. Uh,
Oh, yeah. So this is Ayurvedic medicine. And in fact, I just was on a Zoom call 3 weeks ago with a husband and wife who live in India. The young woman had taken Ayurvedic medicine. And because of that, her blood levels increased to 70 microgram per deciliter. And several months later, she was pregnant and she was trying to figure out what to do with this. Uh, Ayurvedic medicine is not well regulated. And so that's one of the most important sources when we think about India, for example. And I think you pointed out a really important thing is number one, we don't know that there's any safe level. Even though blood levels in the United States and Europe, for example, have come down by over 95%, the levels that we're exposed to, and especially the levels in our bones, are 10 to 100 times higher than our pre industrial ancestors. So we haven't yet reached those levels that our ancestors were exposed to. Are there effects at even lower and lower levels? Everything would suggest we should assume that there is, but we don't know down below, let's say 1 microgram per deciliter, or that's the equivalent of 10 parts per billion of lead in blood. What we also know, though, is when leaded gasoline was restricted in the United States and Canada and elsewhere, the companies turned to the industrializing countries and started to market it there. And so we saw first the epidemic of coronary heart disease in the United States, Canada, Europe. Then that's come down over the past 50 years. At the same time, it was rising in low to middle income countries. So today, over 95% of the burden of disease from lead, including heart disease, is found in industrializing countries.
Right. Now, it's pretty striking, of course, that you have. Is it true that airlines fuel is still with lead today?
Well, not commercial airlines. It's going to be a small single piston aircraft. So, for example, we did a study down around the Santa Clara County Airport, Reed Hillview, and we can see that the children who live within a half mile of the airport had blood levels about 10% higher than children that live further away. And the children who live downwind, 25% higher still. Now, nobody's mapped out the health effects, but one of the things that's particularly troubling about emissions from small aircraft is that the particle size of lead is extraordinarily small. And we know how nanoparticles, because they have a larger surface area, can be more problematic. They also can probably go straight up into the brain and or across the pulmonary tissues. And so those small particles we should be particularly worried about. But it's been such a long journey to try to figure out how to get that out of aircraft. It's a problem. The EPA recognized it. They said it's an endangerment, but the industry is still pushing back.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we still have these problems, and I'm going to in a minute ask you what we can do to just eradicate lead as much as possible, but we're not there yet. But one study that seemed to be uh, hard to believe that you cited in the review, a year after a ban on leaded fuel in NASCAR races, mortality from coronary heart disease declined significantly in communities near racetracks. Can you talk about that one? Because it's a little bit like the one you just mentioned with the airports.
Yeah, now that study, particularly, this was by Alex Hollingsworth, was particularly looking at people over 65. And we're working on a follow up study that will look at people below 65. But it was quite striking. When NASCAR took lead out of their fuel, he compared the rates of coronary heart disease of people that live nearby compared to a control group populations that live further away. And he did see a pretty striking reduction. One of the things we also want to find or look at in our follow up is how quickly does that risk begin to taper off? That's going to be really important in terms of trying to develop a strategy around preventing lead poisoning. How quickly do we expect to see it fall? I think it's probably going to be within 12 to 24 months that we'll see benefits.
That's interesting because, as you show in a really nice graphic, in adults, which are the people who would be listening to this podcast, um, of course, they ought to be concerned too with about children and all and reproductive health. But the point about the skeleton, 95% of the lead is there, and the main organs, which we haven't mentioned, the kidney and the kidney injury that occurs, no less the cardiovascular, the blood pressure elevation. So these are really, and you mentioned not necessarily highlighted in that graphic, but potential cognitive hit as well. You also wrote about how people who have symptoms of abdominal pain, memory impairment, and high blood pressure that's unexplained, maybe they should get a blood level. I assume those are easy to get, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can get those in any hospital, any clinic across the country. We're still struggling with having those available where it's most needed in the industrializing countries, but certainly available here. Now we don't expect that for most people who have those symptoms, lead poisoning is going to be the cause. Right? It'd still be unusual unless you work in an industry, for example, smelting batteries to recycle them. We don't expect it to be real common, but and we're not even sure, Eric, whether we should be doing widespread screening. If I looked at this as a population scientist, the real focus should be on identifying the sources. We mostly know where those are here, and radically moving it down. Right, getting rid of the lead service lines, which was such a big part of what President Biden was doing, and it was perfect. For every dollar invested to reduce lead exposure from those lead service lines, Ronnie Levin at Harvard said there'd be a 35-fold return in cost benefits, really. And this has always been true that reducing lead exposure, throughout the past 40 years has always been shown to be amazingly cost beneficial. The problem is, operating within a free market health system, even though there's tremendous social benefits, that benefit isn't going to be monetized or privatized. And so who's going to make those decisions? We hope our government is, but that doesn't always play out.
Well, what's interesting is, as opposed to the problems we have today that are prominent, such as the microplastic, nanoplastics, the air pollution, the forever chemicals, they just keep getting worse. I mean, they're just cumulative. This one, there was tremendous improvement, but it's still not enough. And I guess you're zooming in on the lead lines, that be the most important thing to work on today. Another thing that has come up, there's been trials, as I'm sure you know, because you're all over this field, of chelation. There's a trial that was run by NIH, supported by NIH, that looked at chelation to prevent coronary disease. Is there any uh, evidence that people who have a problem with lead would benefit from chelation therapy?
Well, there's two different studies, major studies that have been done, and Tony Lamas was in charge of both of them. The first one, TACT study, it was a randomized controlled trial, not intended specifically to focus on lead, but rather it was to look at sort of this alternative therapy. They found significant benefits, about an 18% reduction in subsequent cardiac events. That led to a second study that was just published last year, and it was focused on people who had diabetes. They saw some benefit, but it wasn't significant. So whether that's because there wasn't enough variability in exposure, it's not entirely clear. But we've seen this with lead and IQ deficits in kids, where we can show that we can reduce blood lead levels. But ultimately, what tends to happen is once you've taken lead out of the blood, some of it's released again from the bone, but you still have all that lead in the bone that's there.
Yeah, yeah.
You get some of it out, but you're not going to get the bulk of it out.
Right. It's a reservoir that's hard to reckon with. Yeah. Now, another thing, you have a Substack that is called Plagues, Pollution, Poverty. And you wrote a really provocative piece in that earlier in April called How Estrogen Keeps Lead and Heart Attack in Check. And basically, you got into the lead estrogen hypothesis. Can
Yeah.
you enlighten us about that?
Yeah, this was really a lot of the seminal work in this area was done by Ellen Silbergeld, who's a brilliant and somewhat mercurial toxicologist. And Ellen, for years, I focused on childhood lead exposure. And for years, Ellen would tell me, almost admonish me for not studying adults. And because she had found back in 1988 that as women go into menopause, their blood lead levels increase by about 30%. And that's where most of our lead is stored, is in our bone. And so as I was thinking about this, it all became clear because blood lead levels in boys and girls is about the same. It's comparable up until menarche. Boom. And then young women's blood leads fall by about 20%. And they stay 20% lower throughout the reproductive years until menopause. And especially during those first few years around menopause, perimenopause, you see fairly striking increases in the weakening of the bone and in blood lead levels. So that might very well help to explain why estrogen is protective, because what happens is throughout the reproductive life, women are losing a little bit of lead every month, and estrogen is at its lowest during that time of menses, and that's going to be when blood lead is at its highest because estrogen pushes lead into the bone. Not only that, women lose lead into the developing fetus when they're pregnant. So what Ellen found is that there was less of a spike around menopause for the women that had 3 or 4 pregnancies because they had offloaded that into their babies. So all of this, if you put it together, and this is, of course, in a very short a note of it, you can see that lead increases dyslipidemia. It leads to tears in the endothelium of the arterial wall. It's going to increase thrombose. All of these things that we think of as the classic atherosclerosis. Well, what estrogen does is the opposite of those. Decreases dyslipidemia. It repairs the arterial endothelial wall. So how much of it is that estrogen is protective, and how much is it that it's moving lead out of the system, making it less biologically available?
Yeah, I know it's really interesting. I mean, quite provocative. Should be followed up on for sure.
Yeah.
Now, just getting to you, you're a physician and epidemiologist, MD, MPH, and you have spent your career on this sort of thing, right? I mean, is your middle name like lead, or what what do you work on all the time?
Yeah, I've been doing this for about 30 years. And, this is one of my mentors, Herb Needleman, spent 40 years of his career on it. And in some ways, Eric, it seems to me, particularly in these very difficult, entrenched problems like lead, right? We don't have any pharmaceutical company reaching out to us to promote what we do. We've got industry trying to squash what we do.
Yeah, right.
It really does take a career to really make a dent in this stuff. And in a way, you can look at my trajectory, and it's really following up on what Herb Needleman did and what Claire Pattison did, and that was finding the effects at lower and lower levels. Right, because what we do with lead and most other toxic chemicals, the ones that don't cause cancer, is we assume that there's a safe level or threshold until we prove otherwise. And yet, when you look at the evidence, whether it's about asbestos and mesothelioma, air pollution and cardiovascular mortality, lead and cardiovascular mortality, benzene and leukemia, none of those exhibit a threshold. In some cases, the risks are steepest proportionately at the lowest measurable levels. And that really raises some tremendous challenges, right? Because how are we going to bring air pollution or lead down to zero? But at the same time, it also provides these tremendous opportunities because we know that they're causing disease. We know what the sources are. If we could only bring about the political will to address them, we could prevent a lot of death, disease, and disability. I mean, about 20% of deaths around the world every year are from air pollution, lead, and other toxic chemicals. And yet the amount of money we invest in them is just paltry compared to what we invest in other things, which is not to pit one against the other, but it's to say we haven't invested enough in these.
No, absolutely. I think your point, just to make sure that it's clear, is that even at low levels, this is, of course, where most of the population exposure would be, and that's why that's so incriminated. Now,
Yeah.
um, one of the things I just want to end up with is that we know that these are tiny, tiny particles of lead, and then the question is how they can synergize in fine particulate matter that we of air pollution in the nanoplastic microplastic story and binding to forever chemicals, PFAS. How do you process all that? Because, it's not just a single hit here. It's also the fact that there's ability to, have binding to the other environmental toxins that are not going away.
That's right. And in a way, it's when we talk about lead playing this tremendous role in the rise and decline of coronary heart disease, we can't entirely separate it out, for example, from air pollution or cigarette smoke for that matter, nor plastic. So, for example, with air pollution, if we look at air pollution over the past century, up until the 1980s, even into the 90s, it was leaded, right? So you couldn't separate them. If you look at cigarette smoke, cigarette tobacco in the 1940s and 50s was grown in fields where they used lead arsenic as an insecticide. So smokers, even today, have blood levels that are 20% higher than non-smokers. And people who are not smokers but exposed to secondhand smoke have blood levels 20% higher than non-smokers who aren't exposed to secondhand smoke. So in a way, we should try to tease apart these differences, but it's going to be really challenging. In a way, we could almost think about them as a spectrum of exposures. Now, with plastics, you can really think of plastics as a form of pollution because it's not just one thing. There's all these additives, whether it's the PFAS chemicals or lead, which is used as a stabilizer. And so all of them really are kind of integrated into each other, which again, maybe there's some opportunity there if we really were ready to tackle them.
Yeah, and interestingly, just yesterday, it was announced by the current administration that they're stopping all the prior efforts on the forever chemicals that were initiated, in the water supply. And I mean, if there's one takeaway from our discussion, it's that we have to get all over this, and we're not paying enough attention to our environmental exposures. You've really spotlighted the lead story, and obviously there are others that are, instead of getting somewhat better, they're actually going in the opposite direction, and they're all tied together. That's what's so striking here, and they all do, many bad things to our bodies. So I don't know how, I'm obviously really interested in promoting healthy aging. And, unless we get on this, we're chasing our tails, right?
Well, I think that's right, Eric. And I was reading the tips that you'd written about in preparation for your book release. And you focused understandably on what each of us can do, right? How we can modify our own lifestyles. We almost need 6 tips about what our government do in order to make it harder for us to become sick or in order for us to, to encourage those healthy behaviors that you talked about. That's a big part of it as well. One of the things we're celebrating the 100th anniversary. This is not really something to celebrate, but we are the 100th anniversary of the addition of tetraethyl lead to gasoline. And one of the key things about that addition, there was this debate because when it was being manufactured, 80% of the workers at a plant in New Jersey suffered from severe lead poisoning and 5 died. And it was enough that New York City, Philadelphia, and New Jersey banned tetraethyl lead.
Right, right.
Then there was this convening by the US Surgeon General to determine whether it was safe to add tetraethyl lead to gasoline. One scientist, Gandalf Henderson, said absolutely not. You're going to create a scourge worse than tuberculosis with slow lead poisoning and hardening of the arteries. Robert Kehoe, who represented the industry, said, we know lead's toxic, but until you've shown that it's toxic when added to gasoline, you have no right to prohibit us from using it. Right? So that is now known as the Kehoe rule. And it's relevant not only for lead, but for PFAS, for air pollution, for all these other things, because what it set as a precedent, until you've shown that these chemicals or pollution is toxic, when used in commerce, you have no right to prohibit industry from using it. And that's the fix we're in.
Well, it sounds too much like the tobacco story and so many other
Yes.
sectors that were, missed opportunities to promote public health. Now, is Canada doing any better than us on this stuff?
In some ways, but not in others. And one of the interesting things is we don't have standards. We have guidelines. And amazingly, the cities generally try to conform to those guidance levels. With water lead, we're down to 5 parts per billion. The U.S. is dicking around with 10 parts per billion, but it's not even really very. It's not enforced very well. So we are doing better in some ways, not so good in other ways. The European Union, generally speaking, is doing much better than North America.
Yeah, well, it doesn't look very encouraging at the moment, but hopefully someday we'll get there. Bruce, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I think we all should be thankful to you for dedicating your career to a topic that a lot of us are not up on, and you hopefully are getting us all into a state of awareness. And congratulations on that review, which was masterful. And keep up the great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it.